Hey there, everyone. Welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast. My name is James Majewski. You may know me from a couple of the other podcasts that Catholic Culture produces. I'm the principal narrator for Catholic Culture audiobooks, as well as co-host on Criteria, the Catholic film podcast. I'm here to talk with my colleague and friend, Thomas Miras. Hey, Thomas.
Hey, James. How's it going?
Yes, and it's going well. And our listeners heard that correct. They're in the right place. Your regular host has not gone anywhere. Thomas is here with me.
Yeah.
We're experimenting with a little bit of a different format here today. This will be a shorter episode, and we're just getting together to talk about what's going on over at the website. As many of you know or may not know, the Catholic Culture Podcast is a production of CatholicCulture.org, and Catholic Culture features a whole lot of material, some of which is new on a daily or even weekly basis. And so we're here to sort of highlight some of that, specifically the commentary that Thomas is increasingly contributing to the website. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about a article that you just completed and posted last week on Angel Studios, the title of which is Angel Studios Questioning the Hype.
Right. And I should just add too that, this is a new format that we're doing sometimes, but the main podcast, as you've always known it, the interviews that I do with me as the host, those will continue. But just every once in a while, we're going to do something a little different where we have a conversation about other things, not a straight interview. So
yeah, that's right. And also, I think it's with the hope that we're putting the materials that are available at Catholic Culture into conversation with each other. Perhaps, we've got some cool things coming down the pipeline that I think are going to synergize nicely with other things coming out on other podcasts or other commentary that's coming. So this will be a good way to highlight all of that.
Right.
But yeah, so Thomas, you just wrote this piece about Angel Studios. Do you want to just give us a quick recap on what that's about for those who haven't seen it?
Yeah, well, Angel Studios has become something of a household name in the past couple of years with some of the film and TV projects that they've been putting out, starting, of course, with The Chosen, and then Sound of Freedom being this big kind of grassroots hit, and then Cabrini earlier this year. There was a lot of hype around that, and these are projects that we've reviewed. We've reviewed every season of The Chosen on Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, and in fact, our season 4 review will be coming out, I think, towards the end of this month, later this month. And we reviewed Sound of Freedom on the podcast as well, and I reviewed Cabrini in print when it came out. But my interest in Angel Studios as a company really began around the time of Cabrini's release, because I saw that at this point, it was really interesting that this company had become a household name and had this very strong reputation, and people were talking about it as kind of like, this is the new thing in Christian cinema, and a lot of Catholics were kind of on board with this, really excited about Cabrini, and also, of course, because the director Alejandro Monteverde had directed Bella years ago and directed Sound of Freedom, and so people, he had a good reputation for that. But it was what was interesting to me in particular was the company becoming this famous thing, because that's unusual. People don't usually think in terms of studios, your average viewer, I should say. I mean, I don't really, and I'm, host a film podcast, and I still don't think about studios that much,
Right.
And certainly not distributors. So the other interesting thing is, like, Angel Studios isn't even making, I should say, that they are moving into more traditional production.
But up until now, they've just been a distributor.
That's right. Just a distributor for the most part. And so, they didn't make Sound of Freedom. They didn't make Cabrini. These were films that were made independently and then shopped around to different distributors, essentially, until they both found their way to Angel Studios. Anyway, it's a fascinating phenomenon, just even a kind of like a neutral sense in the history of, Christian filmmaking. Always this kind of like beleaguered, kind of like a weak a weak subculture of film, as most people would admit, and everybody's trying to figure out how to solve this problem, right?
Right.
So, given that a lot of people think that Angel Studios has solved this problem or has a lot of promise to solve this problem, meaning like basically the overwhelming mediocrity of what passes for Christian cinema, my essay, which I've really been working on and off for several months since Cabrini came out, is just looking at that and saying, okay, this is really interesting. Where is this hype coming from? Let's look at some of these projects that they've done. Does it deserve the hype? And how did they manage to make this name for themselves? So I talk about some of the projects, some of the high profile projects, but also their marketing and their unique approach to crowdfunding. So, I mean, above all, I think I come to the conclusion in the article that these guys, the Angel Studios, the Harmon brothers who started this company, are really, really good at marketing. The way that they're able to use marketing to kind of present an image of themselves as, this is the cutting edge of Christian countercultural cinema. And they've been able to use criticism that they've taken, from the mainstream press, for example, with Sound of Freedom, to their advantage in convincing people that they are, they're going to put out the movies, great high quality movies that, Hollywood won't make. And so I do criticize somewhat on the quality end, but also on how countercultural are these movies really. I mean, I could go on. There's a lot of angles. It's a fairly substantial essay, but feel free to ask me about any particular things that you want.
Sure. Well, I mean, first question is why did you feel like this was important for you to write? Obviously, you've been working on it for a while. I remember when we first looked at Cabrini and we were deciding, okay, are we going to cover this on the podcast? We ultimately decided not to feature it on the podcast. And that was because our judgment of it was so negative, frankly. And then you made the decision. I didn't even intend to,
if I remember correctly, I didn't intend to review it at all.
Yeah.
I could be wrong. I think what happened was that the hype kind of provoked me to go back to it. Because when you and I watched it, we didn't even watch the whole thing. We stopped after a certain point.
And that's partly because we try not to be negative, frankly. It's not that we're not engaging with things critically, but we definitely. I
think when we reviewed Sound of Freedom, it was pretty. We were pretty generous in focusing on the positive.
For sure. And in general, we want to be watching good films that we can then talk about why they're good.
Yeah.
But
so I think it was the hype about Cabrini, and also some of the defensiveness of people who hadn't even seen the movie, who were criticizing people who had seen the movie, and those people had criticized the movie, and people were getting upset, because this is a Catholic movie that we're supposed to support, kind of thing.
And that's kind of what I wanted to key into.
Oh,
and
great.
You mentioned this in the article, but it was sort of this idea that it had become an issue, that you had to be on one side of or the other. And so it was no longer about engaging with the film on its own terms, evaluating it artistically, talking about its merits or its lack thereof. And instead it became about like a kind of virtue signal, a kind of way of either sticking it to Hollywood or supporting Catholic filmmakers, supporting Angel Studios as the kind of representative of a new Christian cinema.
Yeah.
And you mentioned how Angel Studios has been very skillful at its marketing, and this was kind of a very deliberate turn for them to kind of hook themselves onto a culture war, a particular set of cultural issues. And then even perhaps religious artistic issues. And so, at that point, the conversation kind of breaks down and it no longer really becomes about the work itself.
And let me give an example of that for people listening. It was very interesting to see. So I mentioned that how Sound of Freedom got attacked. And I go into detail about how some of those attacks actually ended up being justified with the eventual sort of disgrace of Tim Ballard, who is the real life person portrayed in the film by Jim Caviezel. But that movie got attacked. I don't think that Angel Studios probably intended for that to happen. They may not, I don't know whether they anticipated, but anyway, they were able to lean into that and get people to react to the attacks by, we're going to support this movie even harder, right?
And it's true, there were a lot of bad faith attacks.
That's very much
that
true,
were trying to dismiss the issue as though it was.
Well, they were saying this is a QAnon movie and something that's not. There's nothing like that in the movie, so there was a lot of it was really bad faith. But some people were like, we're questioning this guy's story, and that ended up being more credible, with things that came out after the movie came out. But anyway, so after that happened with Sound of Freedom. And again, I know for a fact, for instance, that the director of the film didn't intend that film to be controversial, but that's just how it played out. They took a similar tack with Cabrini, which is really a very uncontroversial film in itself. There's nothing that should really offend mainstream standards, except for maybe the mere fact that it's about a nun. But in terms of how they execute it, there's really nothing for mainstream critics to complain about. And in fact, it got really good reviews in a lot of, I think Hollywood Reporter gave it a good review. I think RogerEbert.com maybe gave it a good review, if I remember correctly. Yep. Anyway, but what they were doing on social media, especially on Twitter, was they were doing this kind of astroturfing campaign where, it was pretty clear that they were paying some social media influencers, and I say pretty clear because in some cases the influencers admitted this, to kind of boost this movie as this is the movie that Hollywood and the left is going to hate. There was this kind of astroturfing, meaning like the creating the illusion of a grassroots support when in fact this is sort of planned and executed in a systematic way. Where they were kind of saying that the left is going to hate this movie, so let's ginning up enthusiasm in terms of that. But one problem with that is, just as these people were saying that, it was getting good reviews from the mainstream in a way that Sound of Freedom, hadn't. Yeah. And then secondly, it
was crafted almost very deliberately not to offend any sort of secular sensibilities.
Yes, that's true, and that is, that is very true.
So it wasn't really owning anybody.
Right. So, but what I was going to say is that what this type of marketing tells you in itself, right? Because if you're marketing a movie basically about who hates it, and stuff like that, then there's a certain indifference to the actual quality of the work as a film that is conveyed by that. We should go see this because so-and-so hates it. I guess at best that's taken as proof that it must be good because so-and-so hates it, but art doesn't work that way. It seems like even with Cabrini, it's maybe a slicker looking product than some stereotypical Christian movies, but we still seem to be stuck in this age-old or maybe a few decade-old problem of we have to support a movie because of things that are kind of incidental to its value as a work of art. Yeah. Also, my critique of the movie was much more about its actual value as a portrayal of a saint than even its abstract artistic values. But still,
anybody who's interested in what you and I had to say about this movie, because your articles were kind of born, at least in part, out of conversations that we had about it, can check out those articles that you wrote. You wrote 2 of them. But in this article, Cabrini, you kind of focused pretty squarely on what I'll call sort of these like meta considerations about Angel Studios as a whole. But another thing that I think that this was born out of was the response that we were able to observe kind of in the world of Catholic media and audiences earlier in the year, or was it last year, when the Padre Pio film came out. It was a very different film. very different kind of set of problems, but a similar kind of inability or unwillingness to see the thing kind of on its own terms, and instead kind of getting hung up on these incidental aspects that you're talking about. One of them.
So what would be an example of that in the case of Padre Pio, the incidental aspects that people are getting hung up on?
Well, I think that the biggest one was, oh my goodness, Shia LaBeouf, a big celebrity portraying a saint, you know?
Yeah.
This is a kind of a version of the cinematic pride of life that you reference in the article. In the article, you're kind of hooking it up to the idea of high production values, of being a kind of artistic idol that kind of confuses our judgment of whether a thing is good or not.
It can be. It can be. I mean, I think it's legitimate to be excited about Shia LaBeouf if you like him as an actor doing that. And in fact, his performance was really good.
Of course. And I think it's legitimate to be excited about high production values if, it's serving the work, right?
But the point when it becomes, a pride of life issue is when it becomes an excuse or a reason to overlook more serious flaws.
Right. And so I think that was kind of at work in both of these films, again, in sort of different respects. But we began to see this blind spot, frankly, because there were not a lot of critics at the time who were talking about Pio, who were negative, or I should say, who were pointing out the specific criticisms that we had of it. And so we did do an episode on Criteria about that. And you later wrote an article for
Dappled Things.
That's right. So maybe we can link to that. But I think that it's not that, Catholic culture is over here trying to be sticks in the mud, right? I mean,
in the case of Padre Pio and in the case of Cabrini, the point was these are moral or spiritual or religious problems that can't be overlooked. It wasn't really about so much attacking the filmmakers as being mediocre artists or something like that. It was really because of I felt a desire to write about Cabrini because of the religious issue involved. Because otherwise, mediocre films are made all the time, and I don't feel the need to write about them.
Right.
And I also don't like to bash the work of people who have put a lot of hard work into something. Because making a film is hard. Making even a bad film is hard work, right? So, and people are trying to make a living, and they just. It's not what I really want to do as a critic. But in those cases, because there felt like there was something higher and also more objective at stake, I wanted to speak about it. But
right, the goal, I think, also is to cultivate an audience, right? So it's not just that we're looking at what filmmakers are doing or what studios are producing. It's not just that we're looking at what other Catholic, film critics or blogs are pointing out about a film and talking about, but we're also interested in if we are trying to tear down this like shibboleth of Angel Studios, ushering in this great new era in Christian film. It's because we want to look at things with clear eyes, make accurate assessments with a view toward, building good things.
Yeah. No, and that's an element of the essay too. And I also want to say, like, one of the things that frustrated me on that point, with Padre Pio and with Cabrini is, it seems like there's very few real film critics in Catholic media. So many of the reviews that you see of a Cabrini or a Padre Pio are written by people who don't think much about film as an art form, and they don't write about it except when somebody, a company, gives them an advance copy of a particularly hyped up new project and says, we'll send you an event, a screener, and please write a review of this. and then they write a review, which, of varying levels of insight. But we need actual film criticism in the Catholic world. I mean, this is something that the church has even said we need over the decades, and perhaps there used to be more of. But what happens instead so much of the time is, I feel that the big Catholic media outlets instead serve as publicity aids, I don't know, for the films.
Yeah, and to the extent that these films become about particular issues or sending a statement, then the whole kind of parish apparatus is mobilized into, buying out theaters to see a film, and again, in some instances, this might be totally legitimate. So you mentioned in the article that the pay it forward sort of method of crowdfunding makes a lot of sense for a series about the gospel, a work that's sort of fundamentally evangelistic, but then some of these marketing tactics begin to break down a little bit when they begin to get applied elsewhere to other projects. And so anyway, I just mentioned that because it's part of, I think, what you're describing here, which is a kind of status quo where there's a sort of way of responding to these films that doesn't necessarily cut deeply enough, isn't incisive enough. And
what really bums me out was to see, for say Padre Pio, a movie that had very serious moral issues, for a site, like Church Pop or whatever, to just post an article being like, here's how you can see Padre Pio, here's all the theaters that are playing it.
Right.
And that's it. It's like, okay, well, where's our journalistic responsibility, et cetera. And you see the equivalent of that with less problematic projects, where it's like, we're rather than sort of like assessing this and discerning that, we are just basically, let's get the word out because this company like asked us to, basically. I'm not suggesting anything untoward or unethical, just kind of a lack of due diligence in terms of actually engaging with things.
Yeah, and to take a more positive tack, again, it's about cultivating an audience and an eye and a taste, so that in the years that we've been working on the film podcast, I can, speak for myself that my taste in films has definitely developed. My capacity to sort of appreciate them and engage with them has definitely deepened. And I hope the same could be said for our listeners. But I would venture to say that it'll definitely happen for anybody who tries to watch some of these masterpieces of film, some of specifically Catholic interest. So it's not that we are desperate for good films, but sometimes it seems that way. Sometimes it seems like Christian audiences, Catholic audiences will just sort of take whatever scraps fall from the table, whatever we can get, and overlook.
People don't seem to be as interested in watching things that are exploring things that are out of the mainstream model. So the saint movies that they're watching maybe not mainstream in that they are obviously not Hollywood productions, but they are kind of trying to operate according to that model, or they're just purely Christian subculture productions. But I think that if people were willing to go a little further afield, and if I think people just aren't aware of all of these great religious films that came out of Europe in past decades, for instance. I think that people's horizons would be opened, and I think it's partly an issue of filmmakers not making good stuff, or people not being willing to fund it and things like that. But it's also an issue of like you said, there may be a dearth of great Catholic films, but I bet you anything that anybody listening to us right now, there's a few that they haven't seen and haven't heard of that perhaps are on the Vatican film list, or we've talked about in other contexts that are really worth checking out. But everybody in the Catholic film world seems to be so obsessed with making something that is acceptable according to a Hollywood style or a Hollywood model and seems legitimate to the average viewer because it mimics a Hollywood style. The influences and the study that goes into it, the artistic study, tends to be somewhat superficial.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm, rambling.
Sure. Well, but and this is something that the church is very much recognizing and interested in. I think it's part of the what was the impetus behind the forming of the Vatican film list to begin with,
Right.
And I think it's very encouraging to see renewed interest in this list of films. We had our episode of Criteria where we interviewed the co-authors of the new book published by Word on Fire about the Vatican film list.
Yeah.
But there's other resources that the church has given us as well, and so something that we've been doing on the podcast, you've been speaking with our guest host Nathan Douglas, also a filmmaker, about church teaching on cinema. So there's been a whole series now on church documents that specifically address cinema. Did your work on that end up in this article at all, or helping clarify some of your thoughts about it?
I think that our work on the Vatican film list informed some of the things I said in the second half of the article much more than reading these church documents did. But I think, if anything, what was reinforced in reading the documents is that what you see in more recent church documents dealing with cinema or dealing with mass media in general is a real emphasis on the need for people, and especially children, to be trained in what might be today called media literacy, or in the terms that the documents use, being able to understand images and understand sort of like the rhetoric of images and the symbolism of images that are used in films, but also, news reports, documentaries, advertising, etc.
Sure.
And to be able to be discerning in that area. And then there is an emphasis on critics, maintaining a certain standard within whatever the thing that they're involved in criticizing is. And so I do see, I mentioned this already, but I do see a real dearth of proper Catholic film criticism out there right now. And there have been periods where in the church's history that there's been a lot more of that. And I think doing the mini series on church teaching on cinema with Nathan Douglas, which we did on Criteria, he has done a lot of research on Catholic engagement with cinema in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, a lot of which happened in Europe or the UK. But there were quite a lot of priests and religious involved in cinema and film criticism and film theory at that time, and some very strong Catholic influences on even more secular film theory. I guess it made me aware that this is possible, and it's just a matter of people having the will to do it. And reading some of those church documents on cinema can be helpful in realizing that this is something that the church does have a stake in. Yep. We did a 4-episode series just on that point. We did a 4-episode series. So we did an episode on Pius the 11th. We did 2 episodes on Pius the 12th. And then the last episode, which just came out, is on the Vatican II era up through the 90s. And I know some people may not be interested in doing that level of a deep dive on church magisterial documents dealing with cinema, but if I had to recommend one that people could just jump in and get probably the most interesting stuff as far as what's in the texts, I would recommend people go and listen to Pius the 12th Part 2. You won't get all the historical context that we discussed in the previous episodes, but you'll just get right into some great stuff that Pope Pius XII had to say, specifically on the topic of religious films. We deal with his comments on that in that episode, as well as things like the depiction of evil in movies and things like that. Things that I think are very much the forefront of what the kind of thing that people are thinking about. And so, you know, in the previous episode, we're dealing maybe with more formal concerns and stuff that Pope Pius speaks very insightfully about. But as far as the stuff that people are like, let's get to the meat of this, as far as religious cinema is concerned, check out Pius XII Part 2, and we'll link to that in the show notes as well. I think that's, if you're just going to get a sample, that would be the most valuable part. Yeah,
and I really enjoyed listening to those episodes, and can speak to they're being worthwhile. I was surprised at just how deep and thoughtful these documents are, and how it's not a superficial treatment at all.
Right.
I'm grateful that you took the time to write this article. I know it probably might have been easier to just set up the old podcast equipment and just dump all this in a kind of podcast rant. There's a kind of a precision and discipline that's necessary when you're putting pen to paper.
Well, that's right. I mean, it forced me to be more accurate, be more fair, go deeper, and you know, it's good to have like a touchstone too that I can reference in discussing these issues and point people to the article, because you know, even what we've discussed just now was relatively light on details, and the article is a lot more, you know, in depth and covers various topics that we didn't get into. So I would recommend that people check that out if they're interested in that.
But in other developments, there's also been some exciting news over at the website talking about our commentary. We've got a new columnist. Do you want to tell our listeners about that?
Yeah, man. Yeah, I'm really happy about this because, you know, I've been looking into different ways that we can, you know, keep improving our commentary section and bring in, you know, illuminating new voices. And so we've got a new writer who's agreed to write a weekly column for us, Peter Wolfgang. Peter is the head of a major pro-life, pro-family advocacy organization in the state of Connecticut, and has written for various publications, including The Stream, largely on, you know, pro-life and culture war type issues. And we've been friends for a little bit, and I've been wanting him to write for us, and we finally found a way to do that. He really hits the sweet spot, I find, in culture war commentary and political commentary in terms of Catholic issues, because he is really solid in his faith and has a prayerful approach. And so when you read him, you don't get all agitated and anxious and angry and despairing. You don't lose your peace reading him. And also, he puts his faith above partisanship or above ideology. He's got a very down-to-earth, engaging voice. He's a shrewd observer. He's been around a while. He's thought-provoking and hip without being kind of like thought-provoking and hip for its own sake. And he's a sober voice as well. He's fun to read. He's got a sense of fun, but it doesn't feel kind of self-indulgent or sensationalistic or, you know, just trying to make a name for himself by showing how hip he is or something. So, yeah, I really love his articles. And he started out with a piece for us on the changes to the GOP platform on life issues, which I think, again, hits the sweet spot of political realism and Catholic fidelity. So I'm really excited I think it's very timely that we're bringing him on right now, actually. But
I agree. And, you know, speaking of timely, the next episode that I think people can look forward to on Catholic Culture Audiobooks is going to be a reading of Humani Vitae.
Great.
Like definitive encyclical on some of these issues. So I think it's a time for all of us to kind of get back to basics. You know, there have been some great victories in the pro-life movement, especially with the overturning of Roe v. Wade. But I think recent events sort of indicate for all of us that there's still a long ways to go.
Yeah, for sure.
And anything else that we want to plug before signing off?
Yeah, you know, one of our other podcasts, in fact, our most popular podcast, Way of the Fathers, which for those who don't know is a early church history podcast, especially focusing on the church fathers, currently hosted by Dr. Jim Papandrea. And he just finished season 4, which was his first season hosting the podcast. And that covered the heresies that had to be dealt with and combated, refuted by the early church. And that was very well received. So I'm thankful that it was a very smooth transition between the original hosts, Mike Aquilina and Jim Papandrea. And starting, I believe, on New Year's Day, we are going to launch season 5 of the podcast, which will bring us into new territory, covering all of the doctors of the church. So a whole new time periods, right? Post early church, medieval through modern. So that's really exciting. I don't know that anybody has done a complete survey of the doctors, maybe in book form that's happened, or article form, but certainly not on podcast form, as far as I know. And right now, you don't have to wait to get more New Way of the Fathers episodes, because he is doing some sort of miscellaneous topics in between season 4 and season 5. And he's going to be covering, leading up to season 5, I specifically asked him to cover two figures who are often not discussed as doctors or fathers, but really should be considered fathers, namely Boethius and Pseudo-Dionysius, because those are two of the very, very most important writers influencing medieval theology and philosophy, and figures like Thomas Aquinas. And so I think that moving from the patristic period to the medieval period without discussing Boethius and Pseudo-Dionysius would leave a little bit of a gap in important influences.
Sure.
So people can, that's sort of like a prequel to season 5 that I'm really excited about.
Cool. Well, great. Yeah, lots to look forward to. And you can follow us to stay abreast of everything that's coming out on the website and over the podcasts on the YouTube. Also, let us know what you think. We're, I think, really hoping that, I'm certainly hoping, I know you are too, Thomas, that this article on Angel Studios will generate some conversation. We'd love to hear from everybody. What do you think? And if you want to see more of this kind of material getting produced, we certainly appreciate your prayers, but also donating. You can head over to catholicculture.org/donate. We would really appreciate it. All right. Thanks a lot, Thomas.
Thank you, James.